Welcome to Veeam on 2024, the session on Embrace the Breach Incident Response Playbook. Really excited to have you here. My name's Brad Lynch. I've been at Veeam now for a little over 6 years, most of that time as an SE and now an SE leader. And I'm joined by Michael Archick. You want to introduce yourself, Mike?
Yeah, how are you? Mike Archick, Enterprise SC out of the New England area. Similar to Brad, I've been here with Veeam a little over 7 years. Oddly enough, I came from the customer side, worked through the partner side, and now work directly with Veeam.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. So the both of us are really happy to be here and present to you an action-packed agenda that you can see here, right? So we're really going to go over four main topics. The first is understanding cyber attacks, and I think we're going to take a bit of a different angle than you've seen in the past, perhaps when you've seen folks go over this. And then second, we're going to go over proper preparation, right? So the best way to respond to an incident is actually being as prepared as possible. So this is really a critical component of that incident response playbook. Thirdly, we're going to go over incident response, really under the Veeam umbrella, right? There's so much that goes on in incident response. Veeam and backup recovery in general is just a niche of that. But we're going to focus on some of the things that happen outside of Veeam, but really focus on, the 4, 5, 6 steps you're going to take in an incident response with Veeam. And then lastly, a postmortem, more lessons learned. Ideally things that we were doing before the incident anyways, but things to keep in mind and things we can improve. So if God forbid another incident happens, we're even more prepared the next time. So with that, let's get started on understanding cyber attacks. So I don't know if folks have seen yet, but Jason Buffington and Dave Russell do a great job with the ransomware trends report. So the 2024 one just came out. What's interesting about this is that 96% of attackers target the backup software in some way. So not sure if anybody out there knows this, where this screenshot is taken from, but this is actually from the first Matrix, which, as you can see, that's almost a 30-year-old movie. And even in that, they're leveraging Nmap. And certainly these tools have gotten more and more sophisticated with Angry IP and things like that. But at the end of the day, they're using Nmap for the back end for the most part. And I really just show this to highlight the fact that if we take this embrace the breach mentality, this zero trust framework where we assume the attacker is already in the network, whether they're internal or external, we assume we're taking least privilege to make sure they can't move laterally and elevate access. It's just highlighting whether it's Veeam or whatever backup tool or a different type of software, right? Maybe they're trying to disable your threat detection tools. Using Nmap and simple tools like this, it doesn't take much for them to identify, what IPs do you have out there that are active, what services and ports and operating systems are running on those IPs to quickly identify, where they want to target and what they want to do from there. Mike, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
I was going to say to add to that, it's like, whether if it's Veeam or other software products out there for data protection, they all run on specific ports. So if they're highlighting and finding specific ports open on specific systems, they can easily correlate that to, hey, this is a Veeam environment or a product X environment or product Y, and use that as the attack vector.
Totally, exactly. So we show this to you, not to scare you, but to scare you a little bit. But the point of this is to help you understand that once the attacker's in your environment, the stats show it doesn't take long for them to identify the tools that they want to compromise. The next piece of this, and you probably have seen a variation of this before, but it's really understanding once what the attackers are doing all the way up until the ransomware is declared. Not going to spend too much time on this. I just want to call out 2 or 3 things. The first thing here that's it's important to understand is it's pretty rare that these ransomware groups are targeting a specific company or specific vertical, and they're out there for months and years trying to figure out how to crack into your environment and find vulnerabilities and do phishing attacks. It's much more common that these access brokers, essentially middlemen, are out there that are constantly scanning the internet, constantly scanning companies and looking for vulnerabilities and phishing attacks to find their way into your network, and then really selling that to the highest bidder. And that's where you see and hear about companies getting attacked multiple times. It's not usually one ransomware group attacking them multiple times. It's the fact that the access brokers sold off that information to multiple groups, and then multiple ransom groups are unfortunately trying to hit your environment at the same time. So then once they're in, right, they're moving laterally. And something that I also find interesting in this, as they create their base of operations, as more and more companies, move to the cloud, if they don't have all their workloads in the cloud, some of their workloads in the cloud, sometimes these attackers aren't even asking for a ransom, or if they are asking for a ransom, it's so you just pay them to get out of their environment. They'll go in there, they'll deploy instances or running on GPUs and mine crypto, and then they'll just get out of there as soon as possible before you can detect what they've done. So as they move laterally, as they try to cripple your backup servers and your recovery tools, like we just mentioned previously, then they're going to declare their ransom. And what's interesting about this and how this is evolving is, yes, there's still plenty of cases where they're encrypting data, but there's more and more cases where they're exfiltrating data, they're stealing data, and then asking for a ransom. So it's just important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I
And I
think
don't.
it's important.
Yep.
It's important to highlight, Brad. I think the fact of it's not a single day operation. These are things that are sitting resident, finding the best targets, finding the best opportunity to call it, disrupt, and as well as get some sort of payout. So having that opportunity to find it, of course, from proper scanning and such like that, definitely highlights. But also knowing that these things can sit resident for a very long time.
Totally. Couldn't agree more. Mike, I'm going to let you go ahead and take this slide because I know this is one of your favorites, but
Yeah,
this is an
great.
important one.
Yeah, when we had put this together and highlighted the fact of like why ransomware is such a worst kind of a disaster. When you start playing into the fact of like when you're building out classic disaster recovery or business continuity plans, you have a finite thing you're preparing for. Like as stated here, natural disaster, flood, power outage, etc. You have a specific point in time when you're going to be recovering from. Most likely, it's the latest point in time you have a backup or a snapshot of an environment. The biggest piece with cyber recovery is you don't know what hit you, you don't know what's happening, you don't know what the timing is. So you really have that. You really don't have a big opportunity of when am I recovering from, how am I going to recover, and what am I even possibly using as a source, or what's the scope of my attack. So, and the other side of things is a disaster in the grander sense with the natural disasters and such, probability is pretty low. Like how often is a truck going to hit your data center or a tornado going to take out your data center? But nowadays with cyber events happening in the news, and it doesn't matter if it's a small organization or some of the big Fortune 100, 500 companies out there, everybody's at risk. So it's an extremely high probability that you're going to be hit by one of these things. So really, it's coming down to the fact of what you're recovering from, where you're recovering from, where you're possibly recovering to, and also, hey, I've got this point in time where I can recover from. Hey, making sure that that's clean to make sure I'm not just reinfecting stuff when I actually execute my recovery. So it really is an extremely different type of disaster, and really does showcase as the worst type. Very hard to plan for.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I don't have anything else to add to that other than I hear about a lot of companies out there doing DREs, disaster recovery exercises. I see no reason not to turn those into, CREs, because it's really everything a disaster is plus more.
Right.
The last piece of this section of understanding a cyber attack is really understanding why Veeam's architected the way it's architected for this exact reason, right? So this Veeam took the zero trust framework, which is a pretty well adopted security framework. And it's a high level framework. It really just comes down to the fact of embrace the breach, assume the attacker is already in your network, and adopt least privilege across your environment. And when you look at Veeam, we took that zero trust framework and put it into what we call the zero trust data resiliency architecture. And there's a few things here that are really critical. So Veeam is very much purposely built and architected to separate the backup software from the hardware. And the reason why that is because it creates multiple data resiliency zones. If we were to keep the software on top of the hardware coupled together, and God forbid, as we see 90%, 96% of attackers attack the backup server, and if those two things were together and compromised, well, now you're going to find yourself in a really big pickle. Whereas with Veeam, if the backup server were to get compromised, Veeam server is borderline ephemeral, right? If you were to compromise or encrypt or even delete or remove the Veeam backup server, you can still just deploy Veeam, whether it's on a cloud instance or in a DR environment or whatever it might be, deploy another Veeam server, scan your primary or your secondary repository, and start recovering your data. So I just like to call that out, that we're very much built this way on purpose. And then when it comes to the different types of primary copies and secondary copies, we cannot encourage you more to have that immutable target for both primary and secondary. And Mike, I might just pick on you if you can expand on kind of the Veeam hardened repository and the
Yeah.
power of the Veeam hardened repository. I think that'd be good for the audience.
Yeah, so Veeam hardened repository, specifically when you're talking about an on-prem performance targeted backup storage, mutable by default. The inability to actually remove that data, modify that data within that time frame of that immutability setting. And then, as Brad had stated, taking that data from both an on-prem environment where it's now an immutable store, having that secondary copy off to an object store of choice, whether that's third-party object providers or the big public clouds out there that support immutability, having that all across the board, all your backup storage, both primary, secondary, on-site, and off-site, be immutable, unable to be modified, unable to be deleted. So in that case of where Brad was stating, say the backup infrastructure, the management system is compromised, that backup data is still safe.
100%. Couldn't agree more. So with that, now that we hopefully all have a better understanding of kind of what an attack looks like, why Veeam's, we feel like we're architected to best fit that, is getting into proper preparation, right? If we're not prepared correctly, then when these incidents take place, it's going to be tenfold more difficult to recover your data. So let's talk about a few steps you can take beforehand. The first, and I'm guessing immediately there must be 2 or 3 eye rolls in the audience, because how many times do we talk about this? But this is critical. A business impact assessment, essentially identifying where you're going to start, is so important, because I've seen many times where this isn't done, and now we're all sitting in a meeting trying to figure out, okay, well, hey, what data should we recover first? And then you're spending hours identifying what's the most important information, most important data to the to the company, or you don't have an answer and you just say, let's just recover everything at once, which is going to take a lot of time versus identifying the 10% of the data that might be most critical. So really making sure you've identified the critical workloads, you've identified the workloads that have the greatest impact to both safety and revenue, right? What's the data that's going to keep both the business and your employees up and running? What data is sensitive or has sensitive data or PCI data that's important to the safety of your customers? And then classifying your data, which kind of goes to the previous point, right? If we don't have a good idea of what your sensitive data is and where your sensitive data is, then it really makes you vulnerable to double extortion, right? Oftentimes these attackers are pretty much always going to claim they've stolen your data. The actual stats behind it are 85% of the time they're going to claim they've stolen your data, when really 70% of the time they've actually stolen your data. So still a very high number, but they are bluffing, at least some of the time. But maybe they've stolen data that doesn't really matter to the business. So is it really worth paying millions of dollars to get back? But if you know they've stolen data on specific machines and it's very sensitive data, then you know how to react. And this sounds pretty basic, and it is pretty basic, but so often now we see customers, and it makes sense, and companies moving their DR site to the cloud. I mean, there's never been a better use case for DR than the cloud. Why spend all this money for infrastructure when you rarely use it? But with that, it's important to understand, okay, what are we going to restore from? Are we going to restore from just backups? Are we going to restore from backup snapshots and replicas? Are we restoring that data to the cloud? Have we actually tested what it looks like to go from a VMware VM to an EC2 instance or an Azure VM or whatever it might be? And have we tested the performance of that? So just really making sure that has been thought through thoroughly.
And I was going to say, to add to that, like destinations, even though cloud has become a very big forefront for options for destinations where some customers may not want to have that dual data center approach. Say, for example, cloud becomes not an option and they need a secondary state. So looking at the sense of like having available resources, having available, cash and OpEx to be able to have that secondary destination, that's stuff that needs to be planned in advance, because based on scale and workload and criticality of workload, details how big that scale environment needs to be to recover into.
Totally, couldn't agree more. And then lastly, have an incident response team, which we're going to table for a second, as we're going to talk more about that. So the next part of proper preparation, I mean, if there's one thing you take away from this, and I hope and assume the majority of the audience is already leveraging immutable repositories, whether it's primary, secondary, or both. But if there's anybody out there that's not, I hope this can move to the top of your priority list after this presentation, and Mike and I will consider this a success. But it's so critical to have an immutable backup, and it might sound like buzzwords at this point or white noise at this point, but we cannot stress this enough. The cases that we see where companies file ransomware support cases and they go to our ransomware support SWAT team, the cases where the customers have immutable backups, they're able to recover their data. The cases that they're not, you find yourself in a much bigger pickle, right? And as Mike touched on earlier, the ability with the Veeam hardened repository to have the single-use credentials to disable SSH after we've deployed our Veeam services upon install. Now you're talking about a case where attacker gets into Veeam, access denied, they can't get the credentials from Veeam because we're not storing them, and they can't remotely access the box because you disabled SSH. At that point, you're talking about a social engineered attack, and the attacker's in your physical data center, which is extremely, extremely rare. Just to build upon that, so once again, hopefully you have immutability. If you don't, definitely enable 4eyes. I would enable 4eyes even with immutability, right? Just
Yes.
a security in depth type of strategy. But with 4eyes, having that as second type of administrator that has to approve certain authoritative actions like deleting backups, deleting infrastructure, editing retention settings for immutability, things of that nature will not be changed until a second approver comes in and approves it.
It's the old adage of the old, nuclear launch. You need two keys to be able to launch it. So say, for example, somebody's deleting a repository, someone's taking something out of service that's no longer needed. That actually goes into an approval list, and somebody else at that admin credential level has to be able to go in there and approve that. So you can't just unilaterally just make very large changes. Has to be validated and approved by another individual.
Absolutely. And I promise you, if stuff does hit the fan, it'll feel just as intense as a nuclear bomb. The last thing here, this is kind of table stakes, don't want to take too much time on this, is MFA, right? Both MFA on the console and on your main RDP session to the backup server. I always recommend that. What I would say just real quick to this is MFA bombing, MFA fatigue is becoming a pretty common type of attack where these attackers just constantly hit the sign-in MFA key, and maybe IT admins are savvy enough to know like, hey, something's going on here, but the more prototypical business type of admin might not, and eventually they get so sick of seeing this notification at 2 in the morning, they just hit approve, and now the attacker has access to that data, and maybe it's a SharePoint site with merger and acquisition data or sensitive customer data, whatever it might be. And what I would say about our MFA is we do require specific code. So those push notifications that are just approved decline are a little more susceptible to this type of MFA bombing than when you have to put in a specific code.
And this is table stakes when it all comes down to it. Like I can't change my, internet provider billing structure without MFA. I can't change my cell phone structure without MFA. So like going down the path of like these deep security features, deep capabilities, and data protection features, these are have tos. It's like I get it that there are times that some of these things might become bothersome, but they are table stakes.
Totally, 100%. So just a couple more things here on the proper preparation phase of this, and that's testing. And I know that's kind of another thing that we talk about all the time, but this really truly is important. When the cases we see where either it's unsuccessful or very difficult or cost the business a lot of time to recover data in a cyber event or a DR event for that matter, it's because there hasn't been proper testing, enough testing and thorough testing, right? So being able to go through and essentially create the piping and plumbing necessary to say, hey, here's our clean room that we've already created. Here's the compute we want it to go to. Here's the storage we want it to go to. It's completely fenced off, and having all that plumbing and piping built out beforehand so that when something does go wrong, just to be able to quickly say, hey, send off this data to this clean room, to this environment, and then do additional scanning, whether it's our Yara scanning, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, or additional AV scanning. And that's something people often say is, well, hey, if the AV tools missed it to begin with, how is it going to catch it on the back end? Which is a fair point, but typically when a day zero attack was missed, immediately those AV vendors are updating their definitions constantly. So now they've updated their definitions. You're able to scan the latest definition into your clean room and make sure whatever it is that you're restoring is rid of and clean of whatever that initial incident was, and then you can migrate it to production knowing that it's safe. Last here is SIM integration, right? So much of this is worthless if there's not that connection between the backup team and the security team. And to be honest, I was kind of surprised this number was this low. I would think it's more like 90%. But as part of that ransomware trends report, it kind of identified that gap between communication between the security and the backup team, right? And I would say we're probably in the second biggest evolution of the backup industry in general. The first was probably when folks moved from tape to disk. I think this is kind of the second biggest evolution of that is the way the security team and the backup team need to be working hand in hand during these incident responses and during the cyber world that we live in. And Veeam's ability to forward these events to services like Splunk and ServiceNow, and then other syslog tools as well, is very important that the security team gets those critical events like deleting a backup, trying to remove immutability, trying to remove four eyes authentication, things of that nature. All right, now the fun part and really the main purpose of the session, the incident response playbook, right? And just to reiterate, everything before in the proper preparation phase is really, really critical to make sure this part of it goes successfully. So step 0 of this is actually an incident is identified. So whether that's Veeam that identified the incident, whether that's XDR, EDR tools that identify the incident, or unfortunately, whether that's just somebody asking you for ransomware payment and that's what identified the incident, that's essentially the first step of all of this. And real quickly, I'll let you take this, Mike. I think it's just important. I think folks on the phone probably have an understanding of this as it's been out now for almost 6 months. But maybe just an overview of the 2 types of inline scanning that Veeam does for detection.
Yeah. So with Veeam 12.1 that was released towards the end of last year, we incorporated inline entropy analysis. So that's iterative process that's happening during the backup process. So we're seeing change rates, whether that's encryption that's happening from a previous and current point, be able to indicate some stuff, highlights from a ransomware attack. It's happening on the backup proxy, so during that backup process. And then the other side of things is looking for suspicious files in the file system of the items that we're backing up, looking specifically at malware links or file extensions that have association with malware, being able to trigger those and be able to trickle that up to the management interface as possible suspicious activity.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'd just like to add to the file system analysis one is, yes, it for the most part is signature based, for lack of a better word, but it does have intelligence to look for those day 0 types of attacks, in the sense that we build a profile of these machines as we back them up. And even if we are backing up extensions that we don't see in our known XML file of bad extensions, if all of a sudden we start backing up files on these machines that are extensions we've never backed up before, and they're not friendly extensions like MDF, LDF files, or JPEGs or Excel files, whatever it might be, it'll still alert you and say, hey, we're backing up files that we've never seen before. You might want to look into it. All right, step 1, and this is before restoring any data, right? I've kind of looked back on my time playing high school basketball, and we had to do sprints before we could hold a basketball. And this is the same thing. So the first thing here is you're going to inform your cyber insurance and law enforcement. And like Mike and I were talking about in the beginning, there's so much to incident response that's not even part of backup or recovery. Right. You kind of hear the name incident response. I think you just assume, okay, recovered data, and we responded, and business is back up and running. We're just a small niche piece to the puzzle of everything that goes on. So I just want to highlight a few other things that are taking place here that probably aren't on you as the backup admin, but that that your whole company is taking on. This is the critical piece, right? Identifying what data was actually encrypted or stolen, identifying the scope of the data that's impacted. If they're saying they stole your data and they're asking for a ransom, you want to know exactly what that is to understand, okay, is this something we really need to pay millions of dollars for, or did they just, take some of Mike's, download files? You want to limit the infection, right? So unfortunately, if that means you need to disconnect things from the network, to turn things off, whatever that means you need to do, the primary goal here is to limit the infection as fast as possible. Like I said before, you want to have a clean room. If you can have a clean room before, like we talked about in the proper preparation phase, you've already saved the company a lot of time and headache, which is really critical.
Also, the biggest highlight for that is you're not restoring back into the area that's infected. You're most likely going to have an environment where you need to recover out of said environment, because the fact that law enforcement, cyber insurance is involved in this, your production environment has technically effectively become a crime scene.
Yeah, and that's such an important point. Something that's really scary, and we mentioned the data point later on, but I'll mention it now, is as part of this survey, also 56% of people responded that in an incident, they just restored directly to production and kind of crossed their fingers, which is very, very, very dangerous and potentially really opens up the risk of spreading the infection again. file a Veeam support case, like I mentioned earlier. Any case that's tagged with ransomware goes to our ransomware support SWAT team who deals with these types of cases. And then lastly, engage your incident response team as soon as possible. And with that, for folks who haven't heard, we acquired a company called Coveware. Really exciting announcement, really impressive firm with a litany of expertise. Just to give you an overview of what this incident response firm provides in the case where you do declare an incident and you need their services, it's really four key things, right? The number one thing is their ability to do an assessment, right? So they're able to go in and help you do that part of the scope where you identify, okay, what data was encrypted or what data was compromised, and they leverage this with a tool called Recon. And what's really powerful about this tool is oftentimes what they see is an attacker might have manipulated a lot of data files where they changed the extensions or changed the names or things like that, but really they might have only encrypted 10% of what they say they actually did. So this tool is able to quickly go in and help you understand, okay, what data truly is encrypted in here, as well as what they're also really powerful for is they have one of the most powerful data feeds on ransomware really in the world, right? I mean, we've seen presentations where the FBI actually references Coveware's data source as part of their presentations, and so they're able to tell you, hey, we know what this ransomware group typically does, or this ransomware strain typically does. If you don't pay the ransom, we can pretty confidently tell you they're going to harass you to the sense of they're going to DDoS attack the heck out of your environment, or they're going to not physically, but they're going to harass your employees or customers and ask them to say, hey, we took your data, pay us $50. And on the flip side of that, if you don't pay the ransom, or if you do pay the ransom, they're able to help you understand, okay, are they still going to give you the decryption tools? Are they going to give you decryption tools that are completely useless? So they're really able to help you understand how, based on each type of ransomware group, how you might want to respond and what their behaviors are going to be. The next is their expertise in terms of negotiation and settlement. That's certainly the last thing they ever want to do is have you pay the ransom. That's the first thing they'll tell you. They'll never advise you to pay the ransom. That's ultimately on you. But what they do see is in the cases that you find that there's no choice but to, maybe for various reasons, they have a lot of success in negotiating that ransomware payment down significantly, as well as they handle all that process, right? They handle the payment, they handle the cryptocurrency. That's nothing, and that's all $0 profit. If the ransom was 5 million and they got it down to 1 million, they're not trying to keep 2 million of that. That's just part of the services they offer.
Yeah, and I think that's an important highlight is the fact that it's customers' first time dealing with ransomware. It's not the first time they're dealing with a negotiation. If they're dealing with a firm whose one of their purposes is to deal with and work with customers and deal with on the negotiation side, it's not it's something that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. It's not the first time for them like it would be for a customer.
Totally. Yeah, this firm handles over 100 cases a month, so they're very familiar with it, to Mike's point. And then lastly, ending downtime, right? So they have another tool called Unidecrypt that will help you actually decrypt the data, right? And this works with over 100 different variants. And what's really important to understand about this is I think there's a misconception that if we pay the ransom, the attacker will just give us a decryption tool and we'll use that. Well, there's a couple problems with that. Number one, it's very insecure. You don't know what exactly that could do to your environment. Number two, it's really more a performance issue. Oftentimes these are very, very single threaded. But something that's nice about Unidecrypt is that you can take whatever key that they provide and run it through the Unidecrypt tool to help verify if this is something that's usable and incorporated into the product, which is really nice. So their services are really powerful, and it's an acquisition that I know all of Veeam is really excited about.
Yeah, you're not relying on the people who cause the issue to help get you out of your issue. That's one of the biggest pieces. It's like it's no honor amongst thieves.
Totally, exactly. So step two here, right? I think a lot of these steps are going to seem obvious, but it's just important to highlight and have an understanding of the steps you're going to take. But step two is determining if the Veeam server was compromised, right? Was it compromised? Was it encrypted? Was it deleted? Anything like that. And what's nice and what we talked about earlier is the beauty of Veeam is, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, it does matter, but even if it was, it's really easy to go deploy a new Veeam server. And whether you have it configured backup to recover from or not, you're still able to recover your backup files, right? That's one of the main value propositions of Veeam to begin with. It's great to have that config backup, but really that's to restore your session history, your infrastructure, your job history, things like that. You can still scan your backup repository and start recovering without any of that information, which is really all you want to be doing when you're in this type of situation. You're not worried about, if my jobs that I created populate again.
Yeah.
So we've seen some customers, I know Mike has, who do this beforehand. Maybe they'll deploy Veeam if cloud, for example, is their DR location. They'll deploy Veeam beforehand on another server, keep it powered off, and then if an incident does happen, they've now cut down 30 minutes of that time for reinstalling Veeam and scanning the repository and things like that, which can be really helpful.
And I think it really highlights the different tiers of the zero trust architecture we've gone with. Veeam is the backup management system is fairly non-volatile. It's where we're storing the data, where the data is located, having the ability to get to it, point to it in the case of a disaster, just slap in another management system, or as Brad had stated, if it's case where you're executing a restore of your configuration to get access to it, the data is the important part. The management system, the infrastructure used to produce the backups is fairly non-volatile.
And then step 3 here, right? So oftentimes the critical path to a successful recovery is quickly finding a clean backup, right? And this is where Yara rules comes in, which is something we introduced in 12.1 as well, right? So Yara stands for yet another recursive acronym, which is a funny meaning. But really the power of Yara is that, right, an AV scan is something you absolutely are still going to do during a ransomware recovery, but Yara helps you identify a good starting point. And what I mean by that is once the incident's been declared, you know exactly what you're looking for. You know the type of file extensions that they put on these machines, the type of encryption scheme they put on these machines, and you're able to then create a Yara rule for that, something your security team will be very, very familiar with, and quickly scan each backup until Veeam, create this Yara rule and quickly scan each backup until Veeam finds a restore point that doesn't have that Yara rule, doesn't have those variables, essentially being a clean backup. And then that's a great starting point for you to then recover that restore point to a clean room, then do additional AV scans and forensics as a starting point to then hopefully migrate that to production.
And this goes very much back to the initial couple slides we had showcased, where not knowing where you're recovering from, at what point you're recovering from, utilizing tools like this, having that, hey, somebody has come to you and said, I hit you with X. All right, I know what I'm searching for now that I have X in the variable. Having the ability to scan for that process, scan for that, that signature, and then finding that latest point in time where hopefully that's either one, not there, or two, the ability to clean it post-process.
Absolutely right. And to Mike's point, right, these are the steps you don't have to deal with in a traditional DR. These are the steps that make CR so much more complex. But these are the tools that at your disposal to help you with that. And then step 4, we kind of just touched on it, but then making sure you're avoiding reinfection. So like I mentioned, so unfortunately, it seems it's over half of customers reinfect upon restore because they're restoring directly into production. They're skipping this Yara rule. They're skipping this clean room recovery where they're doing the additional AV scan. So it's just important to include that into your process of an incident response. And then lastly, the most important step, we're finally here, is actually recovering your data. And unfortunately, respondents to this survey said on average it took them 3.5 weeks to recover. And I would attribute a lot of that to this Gartner report. So this is a report from Gartner that essentially did a report on how to recover from ransomware effectively. And literally the number one key finding at the top of this report is it says recovering from traditional backup won't suffice during a cyber incident recovery. And essentially what they're referring to here is just recovering from a disk-based repository and backups is not enough, because you need to have multiple layers that you're recovering from, right? That's going to be your backup repository, that's going to be your primary storage snapshots or your replica storage snapshots if you've been replicating that. That's going to be your actual hypervisor replicas if you have any of those. It's the combination of being able to recover from multiple of those layers to give you a successful recovery. And part of the reason sometimes people say, well, hey, I only keep snapshots for 3 days. If they've been in my network encrypting data for a week, then I'm not going to be able to recover from snapshots. Well, that's a little bit of a misconception. Oftentimes, you're still going to recover, unfortunately, dirty data. You're still going to recover this infected data to this clean room, and then the forensics teams, the security team, the incident response team is going to come in and use tools like Unidecrypt from Coveware or other decryption tools and still scrub that data clean. So still having copies that are able to be recovered much more quickly than off of a disk-based repository is a very powerful option. And just to kind of bring that point home, right? This is another key core value proposition of Veeam, the ability to, on the top left, have the ability to fail over and have true CDP snapshot-based replication. From the right, the ability to recover from storage snapshot, probably one of the most underutilized features of Veeam, the ability to take your primary or secondary snapshot, whether we orchestrated them or not, and do instant VM recoveries off of them. And then the bottom left is really critical too, right? So many folks, as we mentioned earlier, they may cloud their DR strategy with maybe not a whole lot of thorough testing on it, right? So, can you take a VMware VM or a physical machine or a Hyper-V VM or an AHV VM and restore that in an AWS EC2 instance or an Azure VM or GCP and vice versa? And right, with Veeam, any permutation of that works. You can take a GCP VM and restore it into VMware, right? Any permutation of these different platforms, Veeam has that cross mobility flexibility. And the last piece I just want to mention here, and this is table stakes, it doesn't matter that we were first to do it, it just matters who does it the best. But instant recovery is so critical. And why I still highlight this is because with Veeam, you don't have to just do instant recovery off a disk-based repository. As I kind of talked about, right, the first major evolution of the backup industry was probably moving from tape to disk. Now, I'm not advocating that everything needs to move from disk to flash, but maybe as part of that business impact assessment, when you say, hey, these 5 or 10% are the workloads we need, or the sensitive data to our business, maybe that backs up to flash. And if you're able to recover that data significantly faster than off a disk-based repository, that puts you in a better position to respond to these incidents. Anything you want to add there, Mike?
I was going to say one of the other pieces, especially when you start looking at the different options and different capabilities Veeam provides, you kind of highlight CDP replicas, job-based replicas, storage integration. You really kind of start pairing these together based on the type of workloads. Certain workloads may have a much lower, RPO or RTO. So you've got to utilize different solutions that are in the Veeam portfolio. Whereas other ones may have a much longer RPO or RTO timeframe where they need to get stuff recovered. So maybe those only have backups. So really pairing those different requirements per workload to really elevate what that workload is and how you can get that recovered quickly and efficiently is all based on the different solutions that Veeam provides with technically a single product SKU.
Totally, couldn't agree more. So the last piece of this is the postmortem. As I mentioned earlier, more of a lessons learned. Ideally, everything in here is you're doing this before the incident, but it's important just to keep these in mind and know that you have these options. So the first piece here, Mike and I are going to hammer this point home, but we just see this far too often, so it's worth highlighting again. And that's, are you just using Veeam for backup, right? As corny as it is, the name of the product is Veeam Backup and Replication. So are you using snapshot-based replication? Are you doing CDP? Are you using storage-based replication? Are you using Veeam to recover from that storage snapshots, right? I've seen so many cases where we have been successful in helping folks recover from cyber attacks just by recovering off their secondary storage arrays. And then are you backing up critical workloads to flash instead of disk? So it's really just understanding of, hey, are we using Veeam to the fullest, that when an incident does take place, we're able to recover as fast as possible? Because if you are using Veeam, you have an advantage that other folks in the industry don't have, and you may as well take full advantage of that.
I was going to say, I think the biggest piece when you start listing all the different highlights here, this is all one product set. These aren't individual point products from different providers, different solutions. So leveraging that capability, of course, one, you're leveraging the technology more, you're getting more bang for your buck out of it, but you're also creating a very cohesive solution for being able to execute recoveries at time of need.
Totally. So the last couple of slides here, the first piece of this is the security and compliance analyzer, right? So hopefully all these were green, but if not, if ultimately an incident did take place and maybe a few of these weren't green beforehand, you can come back in and say, hey, what of these can we change? Was one of these, because we weren't doing one of these, did that make the incident response more difficult, or did that cause an attacker to get in? So just ensuring that you're doing everything you can to harden the Veeam environment in general. And then lastly, just the Veeam Threat Center, right? Putting the spotlight on malware, making sure the communication between the backup team and the security team is really tight, so that they're aware of anything we're identifying. They're aware of any type of security breaches that might be taking place, where somebody's trying to delete backups or edit retentions, things of that nature. And just having the Threat Center dashboard as a high-level overview of that is a great place to start. So with that, thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of Veeam on 2024 in your sessions. Mike and I really appreciate you spending a few minutes with us, and hope you have a great day.
Thank you.